We've kept the best to last, and to offer some reflections and wrap up on it all, we have Dr. Caoimhe Nicavade and Dr. Maurice Casey. So Caoimhe is a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Sheffield. She's written 2 books, one biography of Sean McBride, and the other entitled Terrorist Lives, Individuals and Political Violence Since the 19th Century. So she's also published on various aspects of Irish republicanism. And her current research has the intriguing title, Emotions and the Irish Revolution. So Maurice is a research fellow on the project Queer Northern Ireland. I presume that's not related to politics. And he has also written something I'm particularly interested in, the Hotel Lux, an intimate history of world revolution. The Lux was the Comintern Hotel in Moscow, and it's where Big Jim Larkin and Roddy Connolly would have stayed in the 1920s when they were visiting the Communist International and the Profintern. So we'll be very interested to see if there are any references to Larkin or to the young Roddy Connolly in this intimate history. So we'll begin with Caoimhe, who will speak on the topic, Carrying On, Revolutionary Families and the Burden of the Past. So carry on, Caoimhe.
Thanks, Emmett, for that nice introduction, and thanks to Tricia and Anthony and all the team at Universities Ireland for inviting me and for all your generous hospitality. In 1920s Dublin, at a screening of Charlie Chaplin's War Satire, the film Shoulder Arms, a small boy had a panic attack in the cinema and had to be taken out of the theatre. The reason for the child's panic was not the depiction of bombardment, nor the squalor of trench warfare. It was an instinctive reaction to seeing the uniforms on screen. And that small boy was Donogh MacDonogh, the son of Thomas MacDonogh, as we know, an executed leader of the Easter Rising. And soldiers in uniform were at the heart of the young MacDonogh's earliest and most vivid memories, as British troops raided the family home on the 3rd of May 1916, just hours after his father had been executed. So Donogh, then aged 3, left the house with his mother, wheeling his baby sister in her pram, past men with khaki uniforms lying on the pavement with their rifles trained on the house. And for years afterwards, he cried whenever he saw men in uniform, reliving the terror of that May morning. In the incident in the cinema, the sensory overload of a war film with non-stop images of soldiers in uniform, a laughing audience, and a darkened room overwhelmed the child. And fear of soldiers in uniform was common. Oh, sorry, there's Donogh MacDonogh, I should have said, with his younger sister Barbara, and the woman in the fabulous outfit is his aunt, Sister Mary Francesca, sister of Thomas MacDonogh. So fear of soldiers in uniform was common for those children who had lived through the Easter Rising and who had more reason than most to be frightened of British troops. Writing some 50 years after, in 1966, Fiona Connolly Edwards, the youngest daughter of another executed leader, the socialist James Connolly, recalled with clarity what she describes as her cold terror every time she passed a British soldier on the street. And she tells an anecdote of Nora Connolly, her eldest sister, has a gun and they need to hide the gun, and they decide that the best place to hide the gun is underneath Fiona's clothes around her waist. So she was wearing this gun, was absolutely terrified that she would be stopped by soldiers. So the victims of the Irish Revolution, as we've been hearing about today, were not just those who lost their lives or suffered physical injury. Like those who survived physical attack, those who were bereaved lived with the effects for the rest of their life. And in this paper, I want to trace the psychic effects of that victimhood within a small group of children and young people who occupied a particular space in the public sphere of revolutionary and post-revolutionary Ireland, the national orphans, children of the martyred dead of the Easter Rising. Their grief was publicised, their loss was politicised, and their personal bereavement was inscribed into an overwhelming national trauma. So who were these children of the Easter Rising? So I hope you can make out the table. You will see the names of the father, the names of the children, and the age that they were at the time of the Rising. And in total, there were 17 children at the time of the executions in May 1916, with an 18th born later that summer. And I'm also including, I'm also interested in the children of two other notable casualties of Easter week, Michael O'Rahilly and Francis Sheehy Skeffington. So the O'Rahilly, who was killed in action towards the end of the Rising, he was the most senior volunteer killed in action. He'd been an extremely well-known, colourful figure within advanced nationalism before the Rising, and the pathos of his death in a doorway in Sackville Lane after penning a farewell note to his wife and writing his name in blood on a wall merely added to his celebrity. And Francis Sheehy Skeffington, as people will know, was murdered by Captain Bold Colthurst while in military custody. The attempts at a cover-up caused a political scandal, and he was, in some respects, the best-known civilian casualty of Easter week. So there's a core group of around about 20 children who lost their fathers during the Easter Rising, and they're bound together, but the circumstances of their losses mattered quite significantly, as it turned out. So despite being a notionally egalitarian movement, Irish republicanism had an acute sense of status and tied as much to pedigree as it was to personal record. And so that status anxiety also extended to these national orphans who were placed very clearly within a hierarchy of victimhood. And at the apex were the children of the signatories of the proclamation, below them the children of the other executed men, and farther down the children of those killed in action. And in some respects, Owen Sheehy Skeffington kind of sits slightly askance from them all. His father had not willingly sacrificed himself for the sacred cause of the Irish Republic. But other differences are also important. Their age at the time of the Rising, their class, their degree of politicisation, their position within the family, the nature of their prior relationship with their father, and all of this resulted in a varied jigsaw of experience. So I don't have time, for reasons of brevity, I don't have time to go into the experiences of the children during Easter week themselves, although I happily speak about that in questions. Safe to say that some were combatants, some fought, some were onlookers, some were witnesses to their father's last hours, whereas some just were passive recipients of the news that would turn their lives upside down. But one common thread that runs across all the families is the experience of interminable waiting for news. And so goodbyes were also experienced very differently. Some were explicit, and the children could remember very clearly the moment that they said goodbye to their father. So Ina Connolly, who you see here, remembered her last moments with her father, again published in 1966. This is a key moment for the kind of excavation and articulation of memories. So she remembered saying goodbye to him in the chaos of Easter Monday morning as she prepared to leave Dublin and travel north. And this is a quote from her account. "Clutching him tightly, my father, I begged him to let me stay with him. Framing my face with his hands, he said, 'It is not what you want, nor what I want, but what is required of us that counts.'" And this motif of emotional sacrifice was a common feature of the emotional economy of the Easter Rising among the rebel families. 2 days later, James Connolly said goodbye to his 15-year-old son, Roddy, who, again 50 years later, recalled that his father cried when they said goodbye to each other. "It was to me rather strange to see him cry, and at our parting in the GPO, I saw the tears drip down his cheeks. I never saw him again." Only Nora Connolly, the eldest daughter, saw her father on the eve of his execution. And her account of their last meeting was pointedly emotive. It's a really interesting narrative that she constructs. It invokes admiration for her father's bravery, for her mother's grief, and for her own stoicism. And this account was she initially told this story to her siblings on the night of the execution, having come back to give them the news. And then she refined it for lecture hall audiences across Irish America. It's printed in Pearson's magazine and in the Atlantic magazine. It's then quickly published in her own book, The Unbroken Tradition, and later again in her Portrait of a Rebel Father in the 1930s. She recounts it over and over again at Irish political meetings in the 20s and the 30s, and she tells it once more for television cameras in 1965. And these were compulsive reiterations, re-narrations of that traumatic event, culminating with Connolly's famous words to his family, "Wasn't it a full life, Lily, and isn't this a good end?" And I think you can see, just about make out, the tears glistening in her eyes as she told that story for the television cameras. And there's a picture of Roddy Connolly. Sorry, I should have shown him. So frequently learning of their father's death was a communal experience. I just want to say I love this photograph, especially Sheila Humphreys, who we've heard about earlier in the background. She's the young girl glowering at the camera. But the O'Rahilly boys were told about their father's death by their cousin, Sheila Humphreys, as they walked back to the ruined city. They'd been in the Dublin, kind of outside in the Dublin countryside. And their last goodbye was a note written hastily as their father lay dying. Tons and tons of love to you, dearie, and to the boys. It was a good fight anyway. The Mallon family had perhaps the most intensive collective experience of all, as the only ones taken together as a family to visit their father before his execution. 4 children were present at this highly emotional scene, yet only one shared his memories publicly at the safe distance of, again, 50 years later in 1966. Seamus Mallon, by then a senior civil servant in the Department of Agriculture, published his recollections in the Irish language newspaper Inniu. So the 4 Mallon children, aged from 12 down to 2, were woken in the middle of the night and taken to Kilmainham jail. On receiving news of the death sentence, the family grew so distressed that sounds of their weeping and wailing could be heard all the way down the corridor and prompted a priest who was in another cell come and try and comfort them. And Joseph Mallon, who was only 2 at the time, he's the youngest, the second from the left as you're looking, he couldn't remember anything of that midnight visit. But in later life, he memorized by heart his father's lengthy, passionate final letter to his family. 90 years later, on a rare visit home to Ireland from his Hong Kong Jesuit missionary community, he returned to Kilmainham jail. A frail, stooped figure, he walked along the dank corridor and spent time in his father's cell where they had all been together crying 90 years before. And he spoke openly, and there's recorded interviews with him on YouTube, about not being able to remember. But he clearly wished to share something of what it had been like as the last surviving sibling. And like Joseph Mallon, many of the younger children had no memories to draw upon. Donna MacDonagh wrote that he barely remembered anything about his father except a few scraps of memories of him in a volunteer uniform. All Ronan Cant remembered was his father wheeling his bicycle away down the road on Easter Monday morning, with his knapsack on his back and his bushranger-style volunteer hat on his head. Ronan was not brought into Kilmainham jail to say goodbye to his father, but his mother made sure to take a photograph of her son, that's that photograph there, on the 8th of May 1916, on the morning that Eamon Cant was executed, preserving forever the slightly blurry image of a smiling boy on a sunny May morning. And as many of you will know, in December 1916, the Catholic Bulletin published portraits of 23 of the families whose men had been killed or executed during the rebellion. And so, framing them as conventional studio portraits, the Bulletin confronted the reader with the reality of childhood bereavement and the destruction of the ideal of the happy national family at the hands of British imperialism. And the Bulletin politicised these children, using their orphanhood as a lever to solicit political and financial support for Republican organisations. And we know nothing really about what these children felt about being instrumentalised in that way. For some, it may have further encouraged their own political identities. For others, it may have contributed to a later desire to lead relatively anonymous lives. And in some cases, these photographs of the children are the only public images we have, and their grave little faces staring out at the viewer, serving only to emphasise their silence in the historical record. So thinking about afterwards, beyond the immediate trauma of the executions, a further ordeal was the disruption of family homes, as we've already heard about. All the children of the Easter Rising were subject to violent military raids, both during and after Easter week. And in many cases, their homes were abandoned forever. 7-year-old Owen Shees Skeffington was held at bayonet point with his mother and a maid in the drawing room while the search of the family home took place. And this event had a lasting effect on the boy. A year later, on a publicity tour in the United States, he was interviewed by a New York newspaper and said, "They killed my daddy, the soldiers did. They broke into my home, broke my toys, and I thought for several days they were going to kill my mother too. I don't like to be killed by soldiers. I want to die by myself." For Donna MacDonagh, whose account of his fear of soldiers we have already heard, the Easter Rising signalled the end of a secure, happy childhood. His mother could no longer bear to remain in their home in Ranelagh with all of its memories, and she and her children spent the next 12 months travelling from temporary lodging to another. In May 1917, at the age of 4, Donna contracted tuberculosis from a botched BCG injection. spent months in hospital and was permanently disabled. And while he was hospitalised, a further tragedy befell the family when Muriel MacDonagh died of heart failure while swimming. And following their mother's death, the children were taken into the care of their father's family in County Clare after a nasty custody dispute, but rural Clare was no idyll. MacDonagh later commented that he learned as much in Clare of the squalor of life as he learned in over 20 years at the law in Dublin, and noted that his vocabulary at the age of 9 rivaled that of Lady Chatterley's gamekeeper. Raids continued throughout the revolutionary period as many of the widows of the 1916 leaders maintained their own Republican activism, and their homes served as meeting places and safe houses for those on the run, and were frequently targeted by both British forces during the War of Independence and Free State forces during the Civil War. And the children were thus often exposed to repeats of that initial trauma, heightened further by the apparent threat to their surviving parent. But this too is all rationalised as part of their emotional formation. When Kathleen Clark was arrested as part of the German plot in May 1918, she told her 3 sons, "I was being arrested by the British who had murdered their father and their uncle, and I did not expect to be back with them until the end of the war." It was hardly reassuring for those children. And she was explicit about what she required of them. "When I say goodbye to you in the presence of these men who are arresting me, there must be no tears. Remember, these men are our country's enemy, and you are the sons of a patriot and martyr. The British government is giving you boys some splendid lessons for the future." But as the War of Independence gathered pace, Crown forces increasingly targeted these families' homes. And again, Kathleen Clark wrote of how terrified she was when Black and Tans raided her home early one morning, pulling her 16-year-old son daily out of bed and holding up his face to the candlelight to see if he was shaving and thus old enough to be arrested. On another occasion, auxiliaries sat for half an hour at the family dining table, questioning the children and puffing smoke in their faces. Civil War raids were all the more bitter for being conducted by erstwhile comrades, and the damage wrought on homes and possessions had a painful, sacrilegious quality. Anya Kant writes how their home in Oakley Road, during a Free State raid, a cherished photograph of Eamon Kant was disfigured beyond recognition. So how do we know, what can we recover about the impact of these raids on the children who lived through them? And it's quite interesting methodologically. We know relatively little about how the children felt about the turmoil that came with living through a revolution. Their experience is always approached tangentially, through the accounts of others or at the distance of decades. So Daly Clark was described by his aunt, Madge Daly, as being wild with indignation at being touched by Crown forces during the raid in which they examined his face. And when they returned the following night, in his natural desire to avoid a repetition of the humiliation of the previous raid, he went to climb out his window at the back of the house when his mother caught him. Had he done so, without doubt he would have been shot, as the house was surrounded by troops and any excuse was good enough at the time. Other children were described as displaying little signs of distress, even if they were directly targeted by Crown forces. Owen Shee Skeffington was observed by Rosamond Jacob to have had the time of his life during a raid at their house in October 1920, and that he could describe all their clothes and actions afterwards. Joseph Mallon, reflecting in his 100th year, rather thought these events were all part of life, seeing dispatch riders at full speed, lorries, searchlights, the rattle of machine guns, snipers on roofs. But while these raids were undoubtedly destructive and possibly traumatic, they were also potentially validating, reassuring the widows and children of the executed rebels that they were playing their own part in their Republican struggle, that they were carrying on their father's work, and that his enemies were now their enemies. I don't really have time to talk about the Civil War. Safe to say that many of the children of the Rising were involved, saw action, fought during the Battle of Dublin. As we've heard, Roddy Connolly was off in Moscow in 1920 and again in 1922. But I do want to return to the experiences of some of the daughters and the female relatives. So Nora Connolly, who had married Seamus O'Brien in February 22, spent the Battle of Dublin running a Republican field hospital with her sister Ina. And later on in 1922, she gets arrested. And as we know, there were many Republican women arrested and large numbers were imprisoned and interned, including widows, sisters, sisters-in-law and daughters of Republican martyrs. So some were in and out relatively quickly. Maud Gonne and Kathleen Clark were held only for a couple of nights, but others had longer stays, including across the road there in Kilmainham Jail. And it was in Kilmainham Jail that the Easter Rising was commemorated for the first time on the site on the 24th of April 1923, with Mass in the prison chapel and a procession to the Stonebreakers Yard, where the girls all took little souvenirs. And we marched back to the compound where the tricolour was unfurled and Nora Connolly, Grace Gifford Plunkett and Lily O'Brien read papers. And just being in Kilmainham brought up complex emotions. Sheila Humphreys, niece of Michael O'Rahilly, remembered that walking on the same flagstones nearly made me burst with pride. For others, like Kathleen Clark, however, Kilmainham was a chamber of horrors. And the memories of 1916 were ever present, even for those outside. Lily O'Brien, who was interned, wrote to her nephew Ronan Cant that she had kept my eye on your daddy's cell. And so this 1923 commemoration was a moment of solemnity, its authenticity only heightened by the perception of those commemorating were tied by blood and by continuing political commitment to the martyrs. So when we think about the trauma of the Irish Revolution and how people coped with that, it's hard sometimes to pinpoint it. Sometimes it's found in silences, in half voices, and in compulsive retellings of that traumatic event. So I talked earlier about how Nora Connolly spent many occasions recounting her last visit to her father. She told it publicly, she told it privately. She was well used to telling that story. But she went very silent when her husband told gruesome stories about Civil War executions, where the military took 12 minutes to get the men finished off. We might wonder whether Nora Connolly was thinking of her own father, who had to be tied to a chair to be executed. What images flashed before her mind as her husband regaled their friends with stories of protracted deaths and agonising last moments. And sometimes children kept parts of themselves hidden, even from their surviving parent. Kathleen Clark was astonished when her son Daly was found to have a keen interest in the military progress of the revolution, something he only revealed when out of Ireland and away from his family to his parents' old friend, the Fenian John Devoy, who hosted him in the United States on a rest cure for what seems to have been an unspecified nervous condition. Was he wary of being encouraged to take up his father's fight as others had done? Is that why he didn't express his interest at home in Ireland? Or was this an act of bravado, trying to live up to the expectations of his father's old comrade? And sometimes the effects of these experiences carried on into adulthood and were transmitted to the next generation. And this was particularly the case for the MacDonagh children, who were deprived of the stability of a surviving parent after their mother's death in 1917, with immense emotional consequences. And both Donna and Barbara's children have spoken about the emotionally frozen quality of their parents. Donna would not talk about the Easter Rising. He talked about nothing. Barbara was described by her daughter as damaged. Roddy Connolly almost never spoke of his experiences during the Rising with any of his own children, only very rarely giving a very brief answer if asked a direct question. And for some, sorrows came in battalions, and the Easter Rising turned out to be just one in a series of traumatic events. This was something I think which was evoked by Lindsay earlier. So Emmett Clark, the youngest son of the Clark family, was knocked down by a motor car when he was 10 and went from being a boy with a bright disposition to being sullen and morose. His doctor, giving evidence, did not believe that he would recover a normal condition. There was a settlement. As it turns out, Emmett had a very respectable career as a psychiatrist in Liverpool for many years. Donna MacDonagh's first wife drowned in the bath after suffering an epileptic fit. He later married his wife's sister before dying unexpectedly, aged 55. Roddy Connolly's first wife, Jessica Maidment, died of encephalitis lethargica in 1930, aged 29. Roddy too remarried, and in 1948 he lost a child in an accident outside the family home. And among others of these national orphans, marriages faltered and separations occurred. But the Rising remained the great obliterative trauma. And tracing these children through the archives and the memory events of revolutionary and post-revolutionary Ireland yields an incomplete jigsaw. Piecing together something of that puzzle and recovering some of the experiences of these children, some small, some silent, has meant grappling with the question of where can we find children's voices, if at all? As I've mentioned, many children waited some 50 years before they talked about their memories of the Easter Rising, but did so in a deliberately childlike register. They write as children, even though they're grown elderly people by the times of the day in their 60s and their 70s. They're speaking publicly for the first time. And I wonder what it meant to speak as an older person about what it was like to lose your father for the glory of Ireland as a small child, particularly as preparations for a national celebration of that anniversary loomed. And it's not surprising that 1916 is the moment when these children feel able to speak. These significant anniversaries, as historians have noted, prompt deliberate reinterments of the initial trauma. Some children were highly visible in independent Ireland as they carved out political careers of their own that depended both on their privileged voice as an inheritor of their father's political legacy, but also the silencing power of that sacred loss. But I think it was really difficult for them to talk about what that loss meant for them. It had to be carefully framed if it were addressed at all, with the finger pointed at the British state for the policy of executions, rather than interrogating their father's decisions to stage a rebellion in the first place, which might have meant their leaving their families. Others can be found only obliquely, can't find their voices at all, only through their mothers, their teachers, or the multiple layers of Irish officialdom before and after independence. But I think we need to think about agency and what agency might mean when it comes to writing the history of children. Agency is not just about finding voices in the archive. It can also be about silence, about choosing silence and choosing when to break it. Daley Clark's departure for America as the Irish Revolution reached its peak might be understood as a deliberate turning away. Family lore suggests that he was sick of being taken around to meetings and shown off as Tom Clark's son. And neither he nor his brother, Tom Jr., ever spoke publicly about their father. In 1991, Emmett Clark, by then the only surviving child of the family, spoke publicly for the first time in an emotional interview on RT Radio, in which he broke down and wept while remembering his father. Sharing one's childlike self, as Fiona Connolly, Nora Connolly, or Seamus Mallon did when they published their reminiscences, was an emotive rhetorical strategy, but it might also have been about reclaiming an agency that was taken from them in the years when talking about childhood bereavement was more difficult. The children themselves were witnesses to and participants in the narration of their own lives by political movements into which they had been inscribed and into which they later inscribed themselves. Thinking about these children as political agents in their own right, whose sorrowing images helped to radicalise nationalist Ireland, helps us to recognise that agency takes many forms. Sometimes it is about sharing private grief or personal trauma on a public stage, other times it's about stoicism. In examining the multiple ways that these children lived with, through and alongside their traumatic bereavement, I think we can approach in a more fruitful way the history of children and use topics such as the history of children to tell new stories about what the Irish Revolution felt like to those who lived through it on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe. So our final speaker is Dr. Maurice Casey, who will speak on what next, public history of the revolution. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm the last thing standing between you and your Saturday evening, so I'll try and be as quick as I can. Let me just set a timer to make sure I'm under time. So, also in kind of classic fashion, I have decided to speak on technology, but the font in my slides is totally out of whack in formatting. So, this talk, so Conor Mulva, when he invited me to speak at this, he asked me to do something looking into the future. And I took this very literally, and I decided to speak both in a way reflecting on the place that technology has had in the decade of centenaries, but also the place that it might have in public history going forward. And really, it complements John Borgonovo's talk from earlier this morning in thinking of public history. And I was interested that John reflected a few times on how the discipline is facing into headwinds was his phrase. And public history is kind of the way in which historians try to prove their relevance, particularly to the academic powers that be, showing that we can get people interested in it, that we can have these buzzwords like engagement and impact. And a key frontier of that in the decade was social media. And the genesis of what I'm going to discuss is really this idea that I have that the decade of centenaries coincided with a public history experiment that was carried out by a large cohort of historians. And that experiment was called Doing Public History on Social Media. And in the form I personally knew it best, the experiment was called Academic Twitter. So this slide shows, I imagine it's what tech executives see when they walk down Grafton Street, just different economic units of social media profiles. It's a slide from the infamous 2014 government announcement of their 2016 commemoration. So kind of a bit of meta commentary there. So many people in this room will have known me and I will have known them through Twitter first, before I got to know them as colleagues. And while I can only speak to my own experience, I personally saw my engagement with Twitter as a net positive for my career. I gained opportunities through it, I found a community through it. And yet I also think that it has been a net negative for me as a human being and disastrous for us as a scholarly community. And I would like to take this moment to propose a general amnesty for all combatants in the Irish history Twitter wars of the past decade. So if there is a historian in the room who's not used social media regularly to talk about their research, I would be surprised, though I would be less surprised to learn that such a person has had a permanent job for many years, because it is precisely early career researchers who have come under the most pressure over the decade from funding committees, career services, our peers, to build an academic profile on social media. And that, I would argue, has had harmful consequences we are only now beginning to piece together. To think through these critiques, firstly, real and important questions about who in fact owns the public history outputs we created and funneled through social media have gone largely unasked. Instead, we mostly just clicked agree on the terms of service box and proceeded to upload our content to these services who actually retain the intellectual property rights of what we were sharing. Early career researchers have been encouraged to participate in these platforms, which over the years have grown only more increasingly rife with harassment, particularly harassment targeted towards women and researchers from minority backgrounds. While we have policies against harassment within universities, within all workplaces, for some reason, completely uninterrogated, we have not extended anti-harassment considerations into the digital workplace, because these are our workplaces. And even though many of us have been fortunate to work in publicly funded institutions, we often take our publicly funded research and channel it through privately owned and deliberately addictive platforms that then monetize our historical research through placing adverts alongside the information we share. I think that also comes back to a conversation between Kate and Lindsay around ethics. And I think I've been thinking more about what it has meant for me to share people's personal stories and then for those personal stories to be bridged by an advert below and maybe some sort of, heinous bit of atrocity footage above, what it means to actually put people's stories on those platforms. Advertising, why I'm interested right now is because I think we're at a very crucial juncture with the internet and how the internet is developing. We're moving away from the model that was by this internet model we have had, which was made possible by advertising. And advertising structured how platforms like Twitter worked. It created an algorithmic structure of news feeds that was curated, which directed public discourse around major flashpoints of discussion during the decade of centenaries. And future historians, I think, will have a real difficulty disentangling a lot of that discourse as it was played out on social media, both because they'll have to take into account the nature of the algorithmic structure, but also because we've put all of our digital eggs into several baskets and it looks like Twitter is now going to collapse, in which case, what does that mean to the archive of all those discussions? So one particular thing as well, I think as the social media critic Julia Bell states, the atomization of reality brought about by newsfeed algorithms forces us to pay attention to how people feel about events rather than what they think about ideas. And the concept of the public historian became transformed alongside an increasing commodification of individual life over the past decade, which compelled academics to see themselves as having a brand identity, something we also see playing out at the wider university level in terms of marketing and university brands. But brands are something that needs to be maintained. And I myself know that I devoted countless unpaid hours of time crafting these small messages for a vast contextless audience. And that was what I put into the machine, but perhaps just as futile was what I got out of it. And the pull of the newsfeed worked on me like a ripped tide. I was not diving into a pool of information and figuring out my way through it, but being dragged into participating in arguments that I otherwise would not have wasted my time considering. But I'm not going to beat myself up for participating in it. And I don't think you should either, of course. And in a way, I would argue that over that decade, there was no alternative for people who wanted a viable career as a public historian reaching a wider, and this is crucial, younger audience. I think when we think back on the decade of centenaries and public history initiatives, that kind of below 30 demographic still isn't being reached in many cases by public history. In a sense that it was being reached on social media, but as I'm suggesting, we needed to think critically about what it meant to draw our audiences into that space. So it was inevitable and it was consequential. Historical discussions took place on social media that impacted government decisions during the decade of centenaries. John mentioned this morning the RIC commemoration controversy. That's really hard to understand how those sequences played out without tracing the interplay between discussion online and government decisions. But now, it's not just that we need to look for an alternative, but that this kind of search is inevitable, because as one journalist recently described it, today's internet has become an echoing hallway. The social media web as we knew it, a place where we consume the posts of our fellow human beings and posted in return, appears to be over. So this experiment that I've described of academic social media, my sense is that it has come to an end. And we're looking at a far more atomized internet where people will be going to individual websites more so than one Uber website where you access all pieces of information. So the key to me then, in terms of thinking through the future of this, is that we take a key lesson from that Twitter experience, from the social media experience, and apply going forward. And for me, the key issue with Twitter was that its means, we didn't understand the technology and we had no control over the technology. It was there to generate advertising revenue, not to create genuine public historical engagement. Therefore, the outcomes of the platform were always going to be at odds with our own. So, Mark Carrigan, who I really recommend, a sociologist who's written really thoughtful work on academics and social media, has argued that the search for alternative social media platforms is a dead end. For example, he takes Blue Sky, a Twitter clone now popular among academics. You can follow me on Blue Sky, of course. As an example, Carrigan states that Blue Sky can never be a replacement Twitter without its downsides. Yes, Blue Sky's invitation-based structure will apply brakes on the recreation of Twitter's downsides, but the downsides will reappear nonetheless. As Carrigan reminds us, the problems Twitter didn't begin with Musk, even if the platform will end with him. Those platforms develop, he argues, because of how social media platforms reach economic viability through rapid scaling. And in a society premised on economic growth, this is unavoidable. And thus, in a capitalist present, there is no perfect technological platform that can become a faultless venue for public history. So really what I think is important for us to draw out of the decade and the social media decade is these kind of ideas of the structure underlying what is going into the technology. And the way for us to avoid making the same mistake is to get involved in the production of the technology. So already we've had positive examples of this kind of public history that has taken place in the last 10 years. Century Ireland, that's a team of historians working with web developers. Letters of 1916, that's a community group of researchers working within a specifically created technological platform to transcribe letters. Beyond 2022, again, technologists and historians working in collaboration. We weren't in collaboration with Twitter, we were the unpaid workers of Twitter. So the alternative is more of these collaborative approaches. One thing, I won't have time to go into it, but you can try it out. So one thing that I'm working on is a project on history in video games and getting students to develop video games. So I quickly developed a text adventure video game called Irish History Twitter Controversy Simulator, in which you play a Irish historian on the day that the RIC commemoration controversy breaks, and you must choose to tweet or not to tweet. There are multiple different branching outcomes. You either end up on Liveline with Joe Duffy, you get quote tweeted by Sammy Wilson, or the good ending, you don't tweet and you get to spend the evening with your children out in your garden while Liveline plays softly in the background. Why I think that video games are particularly viable an interesting venue for historical public engagement is because of that idea of the branching narrative structure. In that way, you can recreate historiographical argument in the narrative form itself. Where I differ from many digital humanities approaches is that I'm not necessarily interested in how technology can help me research, I'm interested in how technology can help me tell a different story with my research. So, the project that I'm working on at the moment to try and pitch for a future postdoc is precisely this idea of a practice first, not a research first approach to public engagement and technology, working in collaboration from the outset with video game designers, audio producers, and so on, to create output engagements based on my research into immigrant experiences of the Irish Revolution. And that way I'll be going into the archive thinking about what is good material for sound, what is good material for play, rather than going into, first and foremost, to tell an argument. Of course, we want to create impact, we want to change people's mind on history, but I want to see what happens when you go into research thinking first about the technological and engagement structures. One example of this that actually took place last Thursday was my event, the Sonic Seance. This was an event, we had 115 attendees in a space in Queen's University called the Sonic Lab. It's the kind of the height of 3 stories. There's a grill underneath, and all around you, there's 360-degree speakers. So there's also lighting rig. So I took the history, the real early 20th century history of seances in Belfast during the period of the Irish Revolution, and I hired voice actors to record some of the spirit voices. And we had a live choir because all seances in early 20th century Belfast began with a hymn. And then I had sound engineers, I had a production supervisor. And so what this was, so you can see the script there on the right, in many ways a conventional history lecture. I'm giving information. I was at the top as the medium. But then you also see these notes like A7, A8. Those are audio, sound cues, even cues for a smoke machine as well. And it was about creating that kind of immersive history experience. I know Trisha would really hate me if I told her that I was going to have a smoke machine at my presentation, because I know she had a lot of trouble with the tech. But it was really good. But what we've noticed, 115 attendees, we got 70 feedback forms back. Majority of people who came were under 40, and a quarter of people who came were under the age of 25, which are not demographics that you get at Irish public history events. And so the future of Irish public history is about bringing public history to future generations. But we really need to do so thoughtfully with the technologies we're using. We can't just uncritically adopt the technologies that are most popular. So this, in essence, is what I'm suggesting the future of public history looks like. It doesn't look glamorous. It probably looks incomprehensible. But what it is historians getting access to the back end, right? This is what we never had with social media because they were corporations that were closed off ecosystems. On the left is what my Irish History Twitter simulator looks like as a program, just basic HTML blocks. And then, oh, apologies, sorry. I have a head cold. We actually had, in the Sonic Seance, we had jump scares in the Sonic Seance with like knocks coming up from the basement. So that was a little recreation of that. So I am just about to tie up now, but I've got you all energized to go into the evening. So if in the past the public history and technology has looked like a scrolling text feed, then the future of Irish public history and technology, as I've said, looks something like this. So I believe the future of technology and public history lies in creating a generation of public historians who are from the very outset collaborating not just in crafting the historical component of their work, but also helping to direct and create the technological framing in which it is conveyed to audiences. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that we must not simply leave behind academic social media, though I do think we should leave it behind. We should not do so without considering its lessons. Now, as an Irish Twitter historian in recovery, which is something I only say half jokingly because I do believe my relationship with the platform was at times a literal addiction, I can look back on my decade talking Irish history there and count up the positives and the regrets. I made a scholarly community on social media, and again, there's people in this room who I would say I knew through Twitter before I got to know them as colleagues and friends, but I'm glad that era seems now to be over, and I hope we've all learned that lesson. And that lesson is when we ourselves do not direct the overarching intent of the technology we use to do public history, then our work gets twisted towards the ends that are not our own. We risk feeding our work into a machine whose central output is a world antithetical to the kind of society that we desire. Sorry, to prevent you another jump scare. So, essentially, if we want to make a world where people can better understand their own place within it, we can't use technology that works against that fact. So I believe that the past 10 years have shown us that we are privileged to work as historians in a society that broadly understands the stakes of the past and has a comparatively sane approach to public memory compared to, for example, our nearest neighbour. To preserve that engaged public and expand it into the younger generations who will share the nation's future requires that we continue to think critically about the tools we use to speak to audiences and how those tools shape what we can say and who gets to hear us. Thank you.